Good evening. Sorry to stop the concert, but some wonderful songs. I'm Richard Waller, Executive Director of the University Museums at the University of Richmond. Thank you for joining us this evening for the lecture and reception for our exhibition, Chasing Bugs, Insects as Subject and Metaphor, in the Joel and Lila Harnett Museum of Art. Chasing Bugs was organized by the University Museums, and I served as the curator for the project. The exhibition and related programs are made possible in part with funds from the Lewis S. Booth Arts Fund. Usually the first question I get regarding this project is, why insects? And then that's quickly followed by, why chasing? I'm hoping that once you have seen the exhibition, those questions will be easily answered. Of course, this is the home of the Richmond spiders, and we have made sure that they are well represented in the Chasing Bugs exhibition. Since the exhibition opened, the most frequent question has become, why is the entrance wall covered with flies? The hundreds of flies that are your first view of the exhibition and the main gallery of the Harnett Museum shows you that we have been invaded by thousands of insects and spiders of all types in the museum. As we know, insects are everywhere around us. They include more than 1 million species and represent more than half of all known living organisms. Entomologists estimate that the ratio of insects to humans is 200 million to 1. Think of 200 million times the number of people in our theater this evening, and you start to realize just how pervasive insects are in our environment. And we have an entomologist here this evening, Art Evans, that most of you know does the What's Bugging You exhibition. So he'll probably have some dispute with my figures there, but hopefully not too bad. With those odds, it's no wonder that insects play such a vital role in science, literature, and the arts. Our exhibition is about the fascination we all have with insects, and there are artworks on view from 1491 to the present, representing more than 5 centuries of naturalists and artists using the insect as subject matter, signifier, and symbol. The exhibition is primarily from our collections in the university museums. However, we are very fortunate to have many works on loan for the exhibition. As the curator of the exhibition, I am delighted to have received such terrific responses to my requests for pieces for the exhibition for being in the Bug Show. I would like to give a special thank you to the donors and lenders to the exhibition, especially to Frank Razor, who's been such a fantastic supporter of the concept of the project from the very beginning. To the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, with special thanks to Lee Viverett, Director of the Library, Archives, and Special Collections at the VMFA. To Linda Kachurik, Head of Rare Books and Special Collections in the university's Boatwright Library. And I should mention that Linda has also arranged to display some of our insect books on view in the Boatwright Library. To the Morgan Lehman Gallery in New York and the Locks Gallery in Philadelphia, and to Stephen Addis and Audrey Yoshiko Seyo. Thanks go to the artists who loaned us their works: Stephen Addis, Paul Bush, Teresa Cole, Russell Hart, Sue Johnson, Sheila Pitt, Deborah Stratman, Paul Walensky, George Whitman, and Rob Wynn. And several of the artists are here with us this evening. I would like to give a special thank you to Sue Johnson, who will give a workshop in conjunction with the exhibition and who was instrumental in connecting us with tonight's speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce Eric Brown, our speaker this evening. Eric Brown is Professor of English and Interim Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Maine in Farmington. He received his BA in English and Zoology from the University of Maine and his PhD in English from Louisiana State University. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard University and was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Bergen, Norway. Dr. Brown's publications include essays on Shakespeare, Milton, Spenser, and Marlowe, and his research interests range from film to the natural sciences. His books include Milton on Film and Shakespeare in Performance, and he edited the book Insect Poetics, an interdisciplinary collection of essays on insects in a variety of contexts, including Dr. Brown's essay, Performing Insects in Shakespeare's Coriolanus, the play. And we have a copy of the book at the front desk of the museum if you want to take a look at that. It's a fascinating range of essays. The title of his talk this evening is Evolving Fables, Insects and the Imagination. Following the talk, we will have time for some questions, and then please join us in the Harnett Museum of Art to see the exhibition and to enjoy the reception in the booth lobby. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Brown.
Thank you. I would like to formally thank Richard Waller and the University of Richmond for hosting me this week, and also a shout out to Sue Johnson for connecting me with Richard. The title is Evolving Fables, Insects and the Imagination. As Rachel Carson once observed, the insect world is nature's most astonishing phenomenon. Nothing is impossible to it. The most improbable things occur there. Indeed, astonishment and improbability are both helpful terms in understanding the strangeness of insects. From fairy worlds to flea circuses, insects have long held a dual tradition as invisible, immaterial objects that baffle scale and visual conception, while also embodying a sense of endless pervasion in space and time, swarms of locusts, the apocalyptic longevity of the cockroach. I'm interested in this talk to wander through a few of the often indeterminate roles insects play, and consequently the ways in which insects have been used to both sustain and subvert discursive modes as diverse as the epic and the fabulous. One of the great insectophiles, Thomas Moffat, in his 16th century compendium, The Theatre of Insects, considers insects as even more spectacular than other animals being paraded about England at that time. This is Moffat. It is common to the English and to all mankind when they may see those large beasts that carry towers, the African lion, the huge whale, the rhinoceros, the bear and bull, take sometimes a long journey to London and pay money for their places on the scaffold, to behold them brought upon the stage. Yet where is nature more to be seen than in the smallest matters, where she is entirely all? For in great bodies the workmanship is easy, the matter being ductile, but in these that are so small and despicable and almost nothing, what care, how great is the effect of it, how unspeakable is the perfection. This particular relationship between insects and artists has a rich and varied history, especially the unspeakable perfection, the affirmation of ultra-design in such small things, notwithstanding Robert Frost's dark query, if design govern in a thing so small. The 16th century poet Edmund Spenser might capture it best in his retelling of the mythical contest between Athena and Arachne, in which the two weave tapestries and vie for title. Sorry, I couldn't think of a better title for what they were actually competing for than greatest tapestry weaver. But it is the presence of an exquisitely rendered butterfly along the margins of Athena's work that finally sends Arachne into a venomous state of envy and despair, prompting her transformation into a spider and lifelong butterfly hater. Amongst those leaves she made a butterfly with excellent device and wondrous sleight, fluttering among the olives wantonly, that seemed to live so like it was in sight. The velvet nap which on his wings doth lie, the silken down with which his back is dight, his broad outstretched horns, his airy thighs, his glorious colors, and his glistering eyes. A similar tableau can be seen in the painting by Dosso Dossi in which Jupiter paints butterflies so real they flutter off the page, while Mercury in the middle is quieting Virtue, who's trying to interrupt the work to tell Jupiter something very important and virtuous. I see two competing allegories in Dossi's painting, age-old debates between the real and the imagined. One, that the genius of art and true creation, embodied by Jupiter, must be freed from the constraints of mundane responsibilities and worldly cares. The other, that art does no more than ignore the pressures of the real in order to paint make-believe creatures that flit off into nowhere. These are the gilded butterflies of Shakespeare's King Lear, beings whose very beauty suggests an empty frivolity. My sense is that ambivalence towards insects, towards their beauty and grotesquerie, their pervasiveness and their inconsequentiality, is rooted in primal childhood encounters. Insects and their ilk, spiders, worms, so forth, are really the first wild animals most of us encounter in this life. There's a kind of thonic quality, for instance, to the ants. They help us understand the ground, the earth, things subterranean that have an existence beyond us, beneath us. Before Solomon ever thought to make them proverbial for their industriousness, they must have imprinted a more atavistic message. Here is space into which you do not enter, says the ant, and in which we move freely. Similarly, the flights of butterflies. In a wonderful turn of phrase, the novelist A.S. Byatt calls them colored air. And other winged insects draw us into the firmament. How strange to just come into a sense of oneself at a time when the most common animated life around us is digging, soaring, careening, mocking our own plodding, crawling terrestriality. I myself, one of my earliest memories, I think I must have been 2 at the time, is being stung by a bee on the nose. So moles, magpies, other animals might have the same domain, but they can't compete with the ubiquity, the insistent message of the insect. They drive home our limitations, but they also make particular contributions to expanding our imaginative faculty and our sense of possibility. They tease us out of thought, to borrow Keats's words. We understand the place of insects first poetically, as a fantastic realm overlaying but not representing our own. The insect world must be mediated by art, artifice, technology, as an almost impossibly othered creation. And I suspect that is partly the meaning of Mercury here as intercessor in Dossi's painting. Stephen Keller has proposed 5 motivational factors in the human tendency to dislike and fear arthropods. First, many humans are alienated by the vastly different ecological survival strategies, spatially and temporally, of most invertebrates in comparison to humans. Second, the extraordinary multiplicity of the invertebrate world seems to threaten the human concern for individual identity and selfhood. Third, invertebrate shapes and forms appear monstrous to many people. Fourth, invertebrates are often associated with notions of mindlessness and an absence of feeling. The link between insects, spiders, and madness has been a common metaphor in human discourse and imagination. Fifth, many people appear challenged by the radical, what Keller calls autonomy of invertebrates from human will and control. I would argue that each of these revulsions suggests that insects are imaginatively as well as apparently, that is spatially and temporally, different. Keller's first motivation, for example, implies a kind of fictional exchange between the human and the insect, life strategies, so vastly different as metamorphosis can seem an alchemical transmutation, the secrets of which remain enclosed, crystallized, a blank page. The butterfly and moth, the psyches of the Greeks, have long been seen as representations of the soul, freed from its mortal casing. But the transformations they embody are reminders of mystery rather than revelation, sublimation rather than illumination. The metamorphic for the human is almost always already metaphoric. Moreover, our first and often ongoing relationship with insects is an adversarial one. For one, they openly invert the food chain. No other animal feeds so routinely on humans. Stings and bites lead to rashes and fevers. Insects, of course, are powerful vectors for nuisance, pain, disease, death. In Maine, where I grew up and currently reside, the biting black flies are given a season unto themselves. And I'm reminded of Crevecoeur's statement in What is an American, that the only thing that made Nova Scotia more uninhabitable in the early period of colonization than the British was the omnipresence of mosquitoes. It's hard to come up with another example of an animal whose presence has caused whole lands to be vacated or avoided. And whether it's slapping a mosquito on the forearm or diabolically sizzling ants with a magnifying glass, insects are one of a child's first and most repeated encounters with killing. Here are things alive and plentiful, and they can be stopped, mercifully or mercilessly, with the push of a thumb. A brief example from a famous work of children's literature, Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, frames well these competing senses of astonishment, of improbability, with an admixture of morbidity. You'll recall that early in Lewis Carroll's tale, a talking gnat gives Alice a tour of a fantastical garden in which she encounters a series of refashioned insects. They're really living puns. This is from the Disney version. A snapdragon fly whose body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head a raisin burning in brandy, who makes its nest in a Christmas box. And then more poignantly, the bread and butterfly, whose wings are thin slices of bread and butter, its body a crust, and its head a lump of sugar. When Alice learns that it feeds on weak tea with cream in it, she asks, supposing it couldn't find any? The gnat responds, then it would die, of course. But that must happen very often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens, said the gnat. Shakespeare treats such childhood encounters even more viciously. In his Roman tragedy, Coriolanus, the son of Coriolanus, young Marcius, is driven early in the play to destroy a gilded butterfly. He does this by tearing it apart with his teeth. And his mother, confused, I think, as any mother would be at this seemingly unmotivated act of violence, wonders whether his fall enraged him or how 'twas. But oh, I warrant how he mammocked it. Mammock's a great Elizabethan word that's fallen out of use, but it means to tear something into scraps. The boy's drives are replicated in his warrior father, or as one Shakespeare critic puts it, it's possible to see the young Marcius in this context tearing apart the butterfly with his teeth as a training exercise for the heartier fare and bloodier appetite of the grown fighter. And the connection between violence against insects and later stages of martiality is cemented later in the play when the war power of Coriolanus is cemented and celebrated. He is their god. He leads them like a thing made by some other deity than nature that shapes man better. And they follow him against us brats with no less confidence than boys pursuing summer butterflies or butchers killing flies. The pursuit of summer butterflies can be seen in Bruegel's 1560 work, Children's Games. The entirety of this itself a helpful reminder of that patent violence and bellicosity in children's pastimes. The butterfly, let's see if I can get it over here, butterfly collecting is happening over here with the net, and meanwhile down below is someone whose hair is just being pulled. Here's someone just being dragged across the board. Also fun pastimes for children. But there's the net and some of the flies here circling about. Shakespeare, by the way, never uses the term insect, and almost all of his bugs are shorthand for bugbears, nagging, disturbing, even terrifying creatures akin to spirits, witches, urchins, elves, hags, fairies, and such other bugs. This itself is a reminder that bugs occupy an uncanny realm, and that even modern commodifications of the insect geared to children, swallowtail fairy wings, ladybug backpacks, are subtextual recollections and reshapings of monstrous forms and fabulous tales. And perhaps no better example exists of the unsettling wonder and astonishment of insects than the flea circus. Though its amalgam of vaudeville patter, tiny costumes, trapeze, and canon is widely thought of as a Victorian fashion, various literati composed numerous celebrations of fleas and other insects as performers during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Indeed, the tradition of performing animals can be traced back to the medieval court, and Henry Herbert, who is master of revels in the early 17th century, records these attractions in England, such creatures as camels, an elk, a lion, an elephant, a strange fish, a live beaver, and a raccoon, and then maybe my favorite, an outlandish creature called a possum. The attraction for extraordinary fauna also extended to the insect world. Afra Ben reports in Orinoco how she contributed to the king's collection of curiosities by offering some rare flies of amazing forms and colors, presented to him by myself, some as big as my fist, some less, and all of various excellencies such as art cannot imitate. As for the flea circus, the always enthusiastic Thomas Moffat writes, they, that is the fleas, have a very short neck, to which one Mark, an Englishman, most skillful in all curious work, fastened a chain of gold as long as a man's finger, with a lock and key so rarely and cunningly that the flea could easily go and draw them. Yet the flea, the chain, lock, and key were not all above a grain weight. I have also heard from men of credit that this flea, so tied with a chain, did draw a coach of gold that was every way perfect, and that very lightly, which must sets forth the artist's skill and the flea's strength. Equally renowned as a performing flea was not, as in the case of Mark the Englishman's, a flea of flesh, blood, and short neck, but a mechanical contrivance. Moffat's 1599 treatise on silkworms offers one manifestation. Nay, for to speak of things more late and rife, who will not more admire those famous fleas, made so by art, that art imparted life, making them skip, and on men's hands to seize, and let out blood with taper-pointed knife, which from a secret sheath ran out with ease. Those great coaches which themselves did drive with bended screws, like things that were alive. Now, the competing representations of these fleas, both natural and artificial, point to an important theatrical split between real fleas and illusory cousins. Those flea circuses that use no actual insects, but rather play on the willing belief or myopia of spectators. The movements of the circus are mechanical, the flea an imagined adjunct. The display, if not the training of fleas for the modern natural flea circus, seems to have changed little in 400 years. As May Berenbaum describes it, typically flea performers are pulex irritans, the human flea. Females are preferred, at least partly because being larger, they're more visible. Traditionally, would-be flea circus operators begin their training by enclosing them in bottles underneath a light. Sensitive to both light and heat, the enclosed fleas tend to remain in the bottom of the bottle. After a while, the cork in this bottle is replaced by a glass cover. Fleas that jump and hit the glass cover gradually habituate to jumping only a particular height. After about a 2-week training period, the fleas are ready for the stage. They can be hooked up with fine, tiny wires to wagons or coaches, dressed up as historical personalities, or equipped with tiny swords for mock battles. And I think you can see, it's a little bit pixelated there, but some of the very same designs and programming from the early Renaissance period still alive and well in these modern flea circuses. Some audiences were invited to view the performances even under a magnifying glass. In the 1930s, the price of admission at one show was 15 cents, slightly more expensive than a double feature at a movie house at the time. The end of the performance is traditionally marked by the owner offering the performers a hearty meal on his arm in full view of the audience. A bit of flea circus can be glimpsed, I think, also in Romeo and Juliet, when the Queen Mab speech exhibits a fascination with insect remnants, surpassing even those in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and its wings of painted butterflies to fan the moonbeams. While the lore of fairies and insects often dovetail, the hazelnut chariot of the fairy queen seems to reproduce equally elements of those flea-drawn coaches spotted by Moffat. This is a literal rendering of the Mab speech. As Mercutio tells it, her chariot, her transport, is an empty hazelnut made by the joiner, squirrel, or old grub. Time out of mind, the fairies' coachmakers. Her wagon spokes made of long spinner's legs, the cover of the wings of grasshoppers, her traces of the smallest spiderweb, her collars of the moonshine's watery beams, her whip of cricket's bone, the lash of film, her wagoner, a small gray-coated gnat, not half so big as a round little worm pricked from the lazy finger of a maid. The passage is framed with almost continuous violations of space, old grubs gnawing through hazelnuts, roundworms emerging from fingertips, and Mab's ghoulish collection of dismembered insect relics speaks as well to the role of spectacle in insect representation, and often the spectacle of the insect has depended on a tension between its near invisibility and its radical magnification. I have just one other, a later rendering of Mab's chariot, a very different effect that I think sets up very well that some of that tension. But in other words, insects are particularly terrifying because we don't see them until it's too late. And this fear becomes both ironized and augmented when their scale shifts. This transposition of scale is perhaps most famously adduced in those big bug movies of past decades, from The Fly to Them to Starship Troopers and beyond. There's a little refresher on the Them scary poster. But epic transposition of scale has its roots in the book of Revelation, when locusts emerge from the abyss and assume gargantuan dimensions. In this case, their massive scale and marvelous appearance, rather than their invisibility or minuscule craftsmanship, are the sources of astonishment. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion, when he striketh the man. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold. And their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women. And their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates, as it were, breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Now, almost every monstrous quality of these apocalyptic insects depends on their extreme visibility. Though they emerge from a bottomless pit that itself issues forth smoke obscuring the sun, the reckoning depends on a kind of radical spectacle. They are gigantic. They bear the ostentations of royalty. Their hair is long, teeth leonine, exoskeleton is hard as iron, and their sound is the very clamor of epic warfare. Their scorpion tails are both another sign of this excess, the most appalling pain imaginable, while also a concession to the seemingly limitless quality of insects themselves, whose numbers are so great as to seem infinite, fit denizens of a bottomless pit. A striking example of the competing representational forces surrounding insects appears in the Renaissance emblem tradition, which borrows from the epic discourse of Revelation while simultaneously turning its energies toward the kind of mock heroism insects still frequently embody. I'll focus briefly on one here, the dung beetle and the eagle, not one of Aesop's most famous fables, but one of the longest and most widely circulated in the 16th century. It's Erasmus in his 1515 Adagia who elaborates most on the Aesopian fable. The original fable, in brief, relates to the revenge of a beetle upon an eagle. The tale begins with the eagle chasing a hare, which you can see here. The hare in turn begs the beetle to save him. The beetle compels the eagle by the sacred name of Zeus, pleads with the eagle not to disregard him simply because of his small size. But the eagle brushes the beetle aside with a flick of his wing, grabs the hare, tears him to pieces, and devours him. This sets the beetle off on a series of covert raids upon the eagle's nest, during which he smashes the eagle's eggs. The eagle keeps building higher and higher until finally, exasperated that the eggs are still being mysteriously destroyed by an invisible enemy, he comes to Olympus and places the eggs in Zeus's lap. Undeterred, the beetle stuffs himself with dung and flies straight into the face of Zeus. Zeus leaps to his feet, drops the eggs, breaking them once again, and when the whole story comes to light, Zeus blames the eagle for mistreating the beetle. But not wanting to see it exterminated completely, the god urges an end to the beetle's revenge. When the beetle refuses, Zeus changes the breeding season of the eagles so that it would take place at a time when the beetles were not found above ground. The standard moral of the story, as emblematized in El Chiato and others, was beware of even the weakest foe. I'll give you one quick opening emblem. demonstrating that confrontation. In the short mention the parable receives in the first 1500 edition of Erasmus's Adages, Erasmus glosses it similarly. No one should despise an enemy, however humble. But in Erasmus's 1515 expansion, this moral is no longer adequate to contain the conflicting complications of the narrative, nor in Erasmus's fuller retelling is the situation of the powerful and the weak so clearly demarcated or so clearly stabilized, and this indeterminacy seems to be a hallmark of the shifting representational approach to insects in particular, driven in part because of their existence on the margins and at the extremes. In the 1500 edition of the Adagia, Erasmus mentions this fable only briefly. The scarab, in order to avoid humiliation, pushed the eagle's eggs out of the nest. It is applicable to those who contrive revenge when they are angered by some injury. He expands on the fable in 1508. There is mutual hostility between the eagle, the king of birds, and the dung beetle, the meanest, vilest, most evil-smelling of insects, which is born and gives birth in dung and feeds on the same material. But by 1515, Erasmus's entire approach now becomes to deduce what kinship, what similarity, what affinity there could be between two such seemingly contrasting figures as an eagle and a beetle. Drawing his natural history from Aristotle and Pliny, Erasmus considers the eagle's various attributes: monarchical pride, an untamable and domineering spirit, an insatiable thirst for spoil, the king of birds has no love for, nor is loved by any animal, any more than bad rulers are loved when they rule their empires for themselves and to the great harm of the state. The eagle, in short, is at war with everyone. Shifting to the dung beetle, Erasmus no longer depicts him as the meanest, vilest, most evil-smelling of insects. Instead, he's remotivated the beetle's seeming failings, its vulgarity, its penchant for filth, its repellent appearance and lowly stature, into a figure of force equal and opposite to the eagle, which I think is almost how they, in the composition here, are positioned. To the point that one may actually prefer to be a scarab beetle than an eagle. Its annual molting, for instance, suggests eternal vitality. Its relentless rolling of dung, a work ethic disproportionate to its size. This all becomes a mark of epic fortitude. Erasmus rhapsodizes what strength of heart it has in such a small body, what heroic mental powers, what energy in attack. Homer's fly is nothing compared to the dung beetle. Even the dung beetle's most noisome quality is spun as an advantage. While the eagle stinks of the carrion it eats, the beetle actually cleans itself. Finally, Erasmus observes the sacredness of the classical scarab, a virile emblem of the fiercest warriors and most brilliant generals. At the conclusion of the fable, as the eagle seeks the help of Jupiter and the final batch of eggs comes crashing down, the beetle is revealed, and this revelation has two contrary effects in Erasmus. The beetle experiences the pleasure of being acknowledged, finally, while the eagle's grief is worsened when it discovers that the author of her calamity was such a contemptible creature. It is at this moment of disclosure that the war proper, in fact, begins, a perpetual cycle of predation, ambush, and slaughter that consumes both species. As Erasmus puts it, the eagle could not be defeated, the beetle did not know the meaning of surrender. This mutual destruction requires the intervention of the gods, who are themselves divided in their sympathies. Jupiter cannot decide whether the nobility of the eagle and its service to him, both as the deliverer of his lightning and as the recent securer of his favorite cupbearer, Ganymede, should supersede the creature's flagrant disregard for the divine laws of hospitality, supplication, and friendship. Meanwhile, the gods are also split as to who should be punished most, and Erasmus does not hurry to reconcile these divergent readings. In fact, the gods decide rather inconclusively that the scarab and the eagle should wage eternal war as they wished, and that they should never complain about any losses so sustained. Finally, Erasmus erases sympathies almost completely. At times, the beetle seems clearly wronged and valorized, while the eagle seems a fetid, cruel, and lawless despot who deserves extinction. At others, the eagle seems inordinately persecuted, the beetle an implacable, unforgiving, and profane embodiment of impure otherness. As the translator Dennis Drysdale remarks, if he is not as morally reprehensible as the eagle, he is nevertheless as malicious and ruthless. Ultimately, his methods are those of the terrorist. Erasmus ends his treatise by stripping the beetle of all the redeeming heroic values he previously ascribed to it. Indeed, he is thoroughly demonized to square with the apparent lesson, a surprisingly untroubled restating of the 1508 moral that no one should despise an enemy, however humble. In a fable with little of the humble and much of the despicable, this moral seems especially pat, if not contradictory, and the beetle has been emptied of almost all coherent symbolic value. I have just a few other of the emblems to show you, and there is a kind of interesting progression, I think. The very first one here pretty clearly demonstrates the problem of the fable, which is that there doesn't seem to be actually much dramatic tension in a battle between an eagle and beetle. Here you can see that the beetle has a superior position. It is flying down actually upon the eagle rather than in the fable, working its way up surreptitiously. And in fact, the eagle, it seems to me, has taken on some of the qualities of the beetle in camouflaging itself in some of the forest and foliage. This version looks to be, I think, the only one where the beetle seems like it could actually do some damage. And pretty clearly taken from Durr's famous stag beetle. The final one here, I think, is remarkable to me mostly because the beetle and the eagle aesthetically seem to have started to borrow from one another, so that the beetle's wings and the eagle's wings are now almost isomorphic. I'll end with a more contemporary example of the ways in which insects function in the popular imagination, and one from my own backyard. So beyond its pestiferousness, the black fly has become an increasingly versatile signifier in northern New England in general, and the state of Maine in particular. On the one hand, it helps mark those from outside the state as other. Tourists, those from away, are typified by their inability to cope with the clouds of black flies, while many residents of Maine fashion themselves as a kind of resistance force against swarms of tourists every summer. There you are, defenders of the wilderness. On the other hand, the black flies become appropriated not as a means of keeping outsiders out, but of drawing them in. Black fly festivals and conventions have popped up across northern New England and Canada, and these events further teem with all manner of black fly-themed commodifications, from miniature black fly houses and Christmas cards to 5K races touted as good training for escaping the black flies themselves. In Adamant, Vermont, prizes are awarded for fly costumes and sculptures, and in the Mount Washington Valley area of New Hampshire, a number of businesses offer black fly-related incentives to visit during the swarm season. Restaurants serve shoe fly pie, black fly mai tais, and fishing outfitters claim it as the perfect season for, apologies, but getting a bite. I ignore here the additional business generated by insect repellents, hats, clothing, netting, to the point that one retailer observes, "You could almost say we actually like the little buggers." Meanwhile, one town in Ontario, Canada, has gone so far as to declare a 4-week black fly hunting season with prizes given for most tonnage of black flies collected. In Maine, there are at least 3 peculiar commodities constructed around this creature: Gritty McDuff's Black Fly Stout, Gifford Ice Cream's Maine Black Fly Flavor, and Camp Maine Incorporated's Black Fly Roast Coffee, imbibed, quote, for the buzz that just won't go away. These representations, you'll observe they're often of the culinary variety, display a number of anxieties about this particular insect that I'll touch on momentarily, but they also constitute a mythographic system that shares with older, iconic models a paradoxical relationship to insects, in which these creatures are both the guardians of a sacred land and measures of its intrinsic value. The fantasy of an idealized world defended and inhabited by insects has numerous classical and early modern antecedents. The Greek historian Herodotus describes canine-sized ants in India who mine the sands for gold, free for the taking for any bold enough to venture into their hostile territory. And in classical myth, the Golden Age begins only after nymphs shelter the infant Zeus from his father and sustain him with golden honey. The idealizing discourse was so prominent that even Lucian, in his satirical utopias, outlines territories fought over by elephant-sized flies and fleas. Honey and gold also emerge as ironic substitutes during the period of European conquest, Cortez, when he was unable to find gold in the Americas on his first voyage, instead sent back to the emperor a trove of honeycomb, which was apparently enough to sustain commercial interest in the enterprise. The process of mythification persisted in the Quebec region of New France, where in 1636, Paul Lejeune recirculated a kind of Herodotean ant legend. Meanwhile, the commandant goes up higher, continuing as far as the river of the prairies, but upon his return he described these places to us as a terrestrial paradise. There indeed are riches collected in one place, but the mosquitoes are the little dragons that guard those beautiful golden apples, which cannot be had without difficulty any more than the other gifts of the earth. Draconian flies have replaced the canine ants, and Lejeune configures New France as a new garden of the Hesperides, refashioning Herodotus's mythical India into the promise of Eden. Such adaptations establish the essential structural components of contemporary blackfly representations. Insects are the gatekeepers of riches for those smart enough or Herculean enough to bypass them. This veneration of, rather than resistance to the blackfly, is nowhere better exemplified than by the Drosophilic Maine Blackfly Breeders Association, or MBBA, a charitable organization operating out of the small border town of Machias. I was just talking to someone who's visited Machias. Their motto, "We breed 'em, you feed 'em," reinstantiates the divide between us and them, with the us producing and the them receiving the dubious benefits. As further evidence of this discourse, their website includes a cartoon, one panel pointing out, before complaining about them, think of all the good the little black fly has done for Maine. The second panel has two tourists fleeing back to New Jersey, telling the natives they'd be crazy to live there. In a similar spirit, a winning limerick from one of the BBA's annual competitions reads, "Some breeders from Englishman Bay bred a black fly with new DNA. It'll work day and night, you can die from one bite, but it only likes folks from away." As counterpoint to the MBBA's representational emphases, I'll gloss briefly here just one of those products, Gifford's Maine Blackfly Ice Cream. It's composed of vanilla with miniature fly-sized chocolate chips and streaks of strawberry swirl for blood. When I contacted Giffords, they stressed that the ice cream does not, in fact, actually taste like blood or flies. I was disheartened to learn, however, that Giffords has actually now discontinued the product nonetheless. I learned that sales had declined, hypothetically, due to the loss of the initial novelty in the product. I suggested that perhaps an innate disgust deterred consumers, but Giffords pointed out they still produced such delicacies as deer tracks ice cream, meant to resemble wild animal droppings. Moreover, I note parenthetically that the FDA already permits a certain ratio of insect parts in all U.S. foodstuffs. For instance, as George David Gordon reports, FDA regulations allow as many as 56 insect parts in every peanut butter and jelly sandwich, up to 60 aphids in 31.5 ounces of frozen broccoli, and 2 or 3 fruit fly maggots per 200 grams of tomato juice. This is from the Eat a Bug Cookbook, 33 Ways to Cook Grasshoppers, Ants, Waterbugs, Spiders, Centipedes, and Their Kin. Still, the disappearance of the black fly ice cream, it's been replaced by whoopie pie and cake batter, seems at least in part an acknowledgement of the inherently unappetizing quality of its imaginary ingredients. And more compelling still, with the MBBA's strident embraces still in mind, I also learned that the chocolate chips are intended to represent not a swarm of embedded flies suspended in flight, but the crushed carcasses of those flies who've been swatted. This representational strategy pretty clearly counterpoints the Breeders' Association. Here, the consumer triumphs over rather than is assimilated by the black fly. The strawberry swirl blood loss is re-ingested, recuperated. The black fly is flattened, killed, consumed. The ice cream serves as a kind of symbolic and transactive means to defend against their predation, even as the product depends on their bugginess to evoke the desired response of consumption. The black fly is, of course, not the only insect to be commodified in these ways. In one of the more gleeful appropriations, the release of butterflies rather than rice or confetti at weddings has come into vogue. One business claims, "You will depart under a veil of fluttering beauties who will remain for just the right amount of time before they gently and majestically fly away." Here's a sample of that. Truly, I don't know if that is glee in the face of the bride or something else. Much emotion, though, anyway. This still, to me, suggests a kind of containment and subversion. Note, for instance, how these butterflies, unlike some other wedding guests, won't overstay their welcome at all, but just the right amount of time. Meanwhile, they retain traces of spectacle evident in those childhood impressions, or those heroic epic amplifications, or those vaudeville flea circuses, or in a more contemporary setting, the interactive and ostensibly more environmentally conscientious butterfly gardens and petting zoos. Which is to say, whether we or the bugs are doing the chasing, the provocations of insects apply unique pressures on the human imagination. Like Jupiter painting his butterflies, it is easy to lose ourselves in them for a time, which is perhaps one of the most improbable points about them. Thank you. So I think we have time for some questions. I'm happy to field some of those if you do have any. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. You talked about Aesop's fables.
Yes.
That no enemy should be considered small.
Yes.
I'm sure that you are familiar with Panchatantra.
Say again?
Panchatantra, which is one of the earliest book about animals and the lessons we can derive.
Okay.
This is 4th century AD.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay.
Text.
Okay. Yes.
And that talks about an elephant, which is a huge animal, and in his ear, a fly gets in. And he is completely berserk. And so compare the size of the fly and the elephant, as you said.
Yes.
Even the smallest of the
Even the smallest. Yes. That's a wonderful reference, thank you. And it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes about the flea from the 16th century, which is don't discount the evil of the flea, for though its bite be small, yet it does all the damage it can. Yes?
Is there really such a thing as a flea circus, or were you teasing?
I am not teasing. There are real flea circuses, and then there are real flea circuses. So there are two traditions of flea circuses. Some do use real and trained fleas in the way that Berenbaum describes it, which is to say the fleas become habituated to the glass ceiling, literally, that they are encased in. But most of the modern flea circuses, the flea circus, is the kind of sideshow event is done with mechanical illusions and sleight of hand, and it's more really a kind of magical performance, street magic, than it is actually actualizing the insect. Yes?
What stopped you from pursuing zoology?
I feel like I am still pursuing it a little bit, but that's a great question, one my parents have asked me a lot too. I took one graduate course in zoology. It was on polar ecology, and it was fantastic. And if every zoology class had been like that, I might have stayed with it. I felt like if I went into literary studies, I could import more of my interests in zoology in that direction than vice versa. I might have been wrong in that, but that was my thinking. Any other questions? Well, I know we have a reception coming up here. I'm happy to talk more to then. So, thank you all.
Please join us for the reception in the booth lobby and to see the exhibition in the Farmington Museum.